Hello and welcome to this Azure Governance for ISVs recording, summarizing basic governance topics from an ISV point of view. I'm Mike Bezarewski and I'm going to be your presenter for this session. Coming into this session, I'm assuming you're an ISV that has some basic knowledge of organizing resources around Azure, subscriptions, resource groups, and so on. I'm also assuming you have basic knowledge around policies, initiatives, and blueprints for compliance purposes. If you don't, you'll want to review those sessions first. Because this is a summary session, it's going to be shorter in duration than the first two. You can find all of the reference links from this session at https://aka.ms governance reference. That will include all of the documentation and learning links that I present in this session. So time to get into it. In previous sessions, I've talked about several features that are related to governance in Azure. However, I haven't fully talked about when you would use what feature yet, although I've talked about it a little bit as I presented information. For this presentation, I'm going to finish the governance topic by going back to discussions about when you might choose to use different features. I'll start with the SaaS deployment model. When you're trying to decide between managing multiple subscriptions and multiple resource groups in a SaaS deployment model, it makes sense to compare and contrast the two. Subscriptions and resource groups can both be programmatically managed, but the subscription management is a much newer capability and is more complicated than resource group management, although we recently released ARM template support for deploying subscriptions. Subscriptions directly relate to billing and payment, while resource groups do not. You can report on billing against resource groups and tags for that matter, but subscriptions are the fundamental billing unit. Data in subscriptions stays around for a while after being canceled, and the subscriptions themselves are generally visible even after being canceled forever in the portal and the APIs. Compare that to resource groups, which are deleted immediately when the resource group deletion occurs, assuming the data has not been protected from deletion. If there is protection in place, such as a lock, then the resource group deletion will fail. There's information about the cancellation process and impact of the cancellation process in the documentation. There's an unlimited number of subscriptions per Azure Active Directory tenant, but there's a limit of 900 resource groups per subscription. This means if you have a SaaS offering and decide one resource group per customer is your design, once you reach enough customers, you'll need to roll over to another subscription. Although sometimes ISVs believe, well, if I have to do that anyway, I should just make one subscription per customer, the billing implications and long-term management implications, such as never truly deleting a subscription, make that a poor choice in the long term. Instead, it makes sense to use resource groups and track the subscription ID and resource group for each customer. This gives you a lot more flexibility and a lot less to ultimately manage. You'll need to do a resource group for each customer anyway, but limiting the number of subscriptions reduces the number of unique items you're managing. Next, within resource groups, there's generally a limit of 800 resources per resource provider, as in type of resource such as a virtual machine. This does not apply to all resource providers, but it does apply to most of them. This means that putting many customers into a single resource group, while possible, also has a limit you'd have to manage, and it doesn't really buy you that much ultimately. The documentation has a very comprehensive service limits document that covers this information. Policies and RBAC can be enforced at either level, so that shouldn't be part of your decision process here. All that information is generally important for SaaS offerings. For managed app or virtual machine offers, the deployments are in the customer's environment, not yours, so they control the choice of subscription and resource group. However, even in those cases, understanding the concepts and limits will be helpful when supporting your customer. That covers subscriptions and resource groups, but what about tags? Well, that's fully covered in the first session, so I don't need to repeat that here. I will spend a little more time on Azure Policy, however. For an ISV, policy is likely to come up in two contexts. The first is at the customer side. As mentioned in the earlier session, you should be aware of how policy can change or block deployments in the customer's environment. For example, if you have a virtual machine offer and you only support specific machine sizes or SKUs, such as dedicated GPU options, and the customer does not allow deployment of those SKUs, their deployment will fail. You should document any such restrictions not just in your marketplace listing, but in your support documentation. Similarly, for a managed application or solution template offering, resources are being deployed in the customer's environment. So again, their policy could prevent successful deployment. You should document what your expectations are for a successful deployment. For a SaaS deployment, where you're offering services to customers deployed in your subscription, you can use policy and initiatives to control your SaaS deployments and your developer deployments to ensure regional compliance and cost controls. It's not unusual for an ISV to have deployments managed by your developers either directly through delegation or indirectly through DevOps deployment pipelines. Ensuring developers are deploying those resources where you want and the way you want falls into the trust but verify category. You're trusting the developers, but you're going to use that guardrails for Azure concept to ensure they don't accidentally deploy resources incorrectly. So that's the ISV view of policies and by extension initiatives. That session also described Azure blueprints, however. How do they fit into the ISV picture? One way is to take advantage of the ability to import and export blueprints. For an ISV, this means you can treat blueprints as another form of infrastructure as code, managing them in your source code control system. You can also share them with your customers as part of example deployment scenarios. The documentation covers the life cycle of blueprints, as well as how to import and export them. One thing to remember is that if you're going to use Azure Blueprints to deploy your SaaS environment as a collection of templates, permissions, etc., you'll want to include your resource group versus subscription decision as part of that. This is because although blueprints can deploy multiple resource groups, they are deployed or assigned at the subscription level. If the names of target resource groups are hard-coded in your blueprint rather than being parameterized, you won't be able to deploy the template multiple times in the same subscription, for example, for parallel environments. By parameterizing the resource group name, you can deploy parallel instances of the blueprint in a single subscription. The alternative is to have unique subscriptions for each environment. Some customers choose to do this, but it's going to be a substantial amount of extra overhead compared to using separate resource groups. Furthermore, for other marketplace offering types, parameterizing the resource group name lets you send customers reference deployment blueprints without making assumptions about resource group names in their environments. And with that, I've reached the end of this governance session about all-up governance from an ISV point of view. This is the last of 3 sessions, after one on organizing resources in Azure and one on compliance using policies, initiatives, and blueprints. I hope you found this helpful. Remember, you can find the reference links at https://aka.ms governance reference. Thank you for watching, and I hope this helps you invent with purpose on Microsoft Azure.